62 million people watched in silence as Joe Biden looked a black Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in the eye and said 11 words like shrapnel across, "Your blood isn't American." But what happened next left the entire chamber frozen. Jasmine Crockett didn't yell. She reached into a velvet case, pulled out a folded flag from World War II, and exposed a 78-year-old lie the government hoped you'd never hear. A man who stormed the beaches of Normandy and never came home. The cameras didn't blink. The chairman forgot how to speak, and Joe Biden had nowhere left to hide. So what truth did Jasmine reveal that turned a folded flag into a national reckoning and made millions question everything they thought they knew about patriotism? To better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. The congressional chamber wasn't supposed to be interesting that day. The agenda looked routine. A budget review, a few testimonies, and the usual partisan theater most Americans had grown numb to. Cameras from every major news outlet had taken their places, not out of urgency but habit. Reporters sipped lukewarm coffee, ready to jot down sound bites, not headlines. And then the doors opened. Joe Biden walked in with that familiar gait, part politician, part performer. Though no longer president, he still carried the aura of someone too seasoned to be questioned. He chuckled at his own joke before even delivering it, turning to a staffer beside him and muttering, "Another day, another performative hearing," loud enough for others to hear. A few chuckled. One aide laughed too hard, the kind of laugh meant to secure favor. Biden straightened his tie, waved at a few familiar faces, then leaned into the microphone and smiled as if he already knew how the next 2 hours would unfold. He didn't. Then, without fanfare, Jasmine Crockett entered from the side door. No entourage, no security, no eye contact. She walked slowly, deliberately, carrying nothing but a worn leather folder pressed tightly under her arm. She wore no lapel pin, no makeup for the cameras, just purpose. Her steps made no noise on the carpet, but her presence pulled the energy in the room toward her like gravity. She didn't look left or right, didn't glance at Biden, didn't acknowledge the cameras. She moved like someone who was carrying something heavier than paper, and everyone, even those who didn't know who she was, felt the room shift. The contrast was unmissable. A former president basking in the glow of power and familiarity, and a congresswoman walking into the room like a shadow that had returned for unfinished business. 15 minutes into the hearing, the questioning began. Numbers, charts, fiscal terms. It was dull, the kind of bureaucratic dance the public only half listens to. Biden, still grinning, fielded the questions like softballs. He leaned back, arms crossed, occasionally tossing out a quip or a nostalgic anecdote from his presidency. Laughter trickled through the chamber like carbonation. One senator jokingly asked Biden if he missed the White House breakfast buffet. He responded, "Only the waffles." Everything else was overcooked or underfunded. Another chuckle. The audience relaxed. It felt familiar, light, even charming, until Jasmine's microphone turned red. She hadn't spoken yet, but now as the chairman gestured for her to proceed, all eyes turned toward her seat. She adjusted the mic, slowly, methodically. Her fingers had never left the folder. Before she could say a word, Biden leaned forward, voice casual but edged with something sharper. "You know," he said, loud enough to interrupt the chair, "your blood isn't even American?" The words hit the air like a slap in a cathedral. Silence wasn't just instant, it was absolute. No gas, no shuffling, just stillness. Even the live captions on the news broadcasts seemed to hesitate. Staffers froze mid-note. A camera operator let out an audible exhale. The joke, if that's what it was supposed to be, didn't land. It detonated. Biden leaned back again, as if the sentence he dropped was a punchline only he understood. He smirked, expecting discomfort, maybe a response. But Jasmine said nothing. Not yet. Her eyes didn't widen. Her expression didn't change. She simply looked at him, not with rage, not even with surprise, but with the steady gaze of someone who had heard this line too many times before and had finally decided it was time the country heard the answer. What no one knew What Biden himself would soon regret was that Jasmine hadn't come to debate. She had come to bury a lie that was older than his career. And that slim folder she carried? It held something heavier than any insult he could throw. That was the last time anyone in that chamber laughed. For a moment, no one moved. Biden's words still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Insulting, absurd, and unforgivable. But Jasmine Crockett didn't react like they expected. She didn't snap back. She didn't shout him down. She simply reached into her lap and placed a small velvet case on the table in front of her. It made no sound, but the gesture was deafening. Biden leaned back in his chair, rolled his eyes, and muttered with a theatrical sigh, "Here we go." A few aides chuckled awkwardly, unsure if it was safe to laugh. Even the chairman gave a nervous half-chuckle, more out of reflex than amusement. The tension had been broken, just barely, but it wasn't relief. It was the kind of fragile breath people take before realizing they've walked into the eye of a storm. The velvet case was old, worn, the edges frayed from decades of hands, too reverent to toss it aside, but too hurt to put it on display. It didn't look like much to the cameras. Just another symbolic gesture, they assumed. Another pageant in the ritual of political theater. But to Jasmine, it wasn't symbolism, it was proof. And she hadn't brought it to show and tell. She brought it to confront. She let her hand rest on the case for a moment, then looked up. Not at the cameras, not at the chairman, not at the press, but directly at Joe Biden. And in a tone that was more steady than soft, more surgical than sentimental, she began. "My grandfather's name was Clarence Crockett," she said, voice unwavering. "He was a private in the U.S. Army, 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion." The room stilled again. Biden's smirk faded, just a little. "He landed at Utah Beach on June 6, 1944. D-Day," Jasmine continued. "He carried steel cable, a rifle, and the belief that even a country that treated him as less than human was still worth dying for." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't falter. It just cut. Clean, direct, unstoppable. "He died 3 days later, dragging 2 wounded white soldiers through a minefield. One of them wrote a letter to my grandmother. The government never did." She paused, not to gather herself, but to let the words settle. The chairman leaned forward slightly, lips parted as if about to speak, but he didn't. No one did. Jasmine looked down at the case again, gently opened the lid, and revealed the flag folded inside. Creased, faded, and fragile, but whole. "This is what they gave her," she said. "No funeral, no ceremony, no name on a wall. Just this." She looked back at Biden. "Not even a grave at Arlington. He's buried in France, buried like he never belonged here in the first place." The shock hit differently this time. It wasn't explosive like Biden's insult. It was slow, suffocating, the kind of realization that makes people shift in their seats because they know they can't look away. Jasmine had just drawn a direct line from Normandy to this hearing room, connecting one man's sacrifice to a nation's silence. And suddenly, her presence wasn't just personal, it was generational. A congresswoman's bloodline had once bled for the very flag Biden accused her of not belonging to. And that flag, now resting on the table between them, stared back at him like an accusation he couldn't explain away. For the first time, it wasn't Jasmine who looked out of place in that room. It was him. The silence following Jasmine's story could have swallowed the room whole. But Biden, seasoned, stubborn, and perhaps still clinging to the illusion of control, leaned forward with a tight smile and tried to seize the moment back. His tone shifted back to casual, almost teasing, the way someone jokes to defuse a bomb they don't realize has already exploded. "Let's not pretend this is about oversight," he said, voice oozing with condescension. "You're not here to protect anyone. You're here to trend." The words hung in the air, not with power but with desperate bravado. A few awkward coughs passed for laughs from staffers who didn't know better. Biden smirked as if he had landed a punch. But across the table, Jasmine didn't blink. She simply tilted her head slightly like a teacher who's just caught a student cheating, then replied with one sentence. Short, unshaken, final. I'm here because you took $78 million from the men who carry this country on their backs. It didn't shout. It didn't sting. It landed, like a gavel that echoed long after it struck. Even those watching from home could feel it. Suddenly, this wasn't a debate. It was an autopsy. And Biden, sitting tall only minutes earlier, now looked just a bit smaller in his seat. Without looking away from him, Jasmine reached into her folder. Not the velvet case. That moment had passed. This time, it was something colder, sharper. She pulled out a thin paper-clipped stack and slid it across the table in a single deliberate motion. It stopped just inches from Biden's hand. He didn't touch it, but the camera zoomed in. The seal was visible. The dates were clear. And at the top of the first page was the one thing no one in that room was prepared to see on national television: his signature. This, Jasmine said, is how history gets rewritten before it's even lived. The room went still again, but this time it was different. No insult had been thrown, no voice raised, just proof. Hard numbers. Cold ink. Line after line detailing how Biden's department had diverted tens of millions of dollars meant for minority veteran outreach programs and redirected it toward public relations campaigns in battleground states. One memo in particular had been highlighted. It included a note scribbled in the margin: minority outreach, low ROI. The sound that followed wasn't gasping. It wasn't outrage. It was change. You could feel it. The type of silence that comes not from disbelief, but from the realization that what you feared was true all along. Biden's jaw clenched. His smile vanished. He sat perfectly still, but his eyes moved, flicking down toward the papers, then away, then back. He looked not like a man under attack, but like a man caught in a spotlight he had once commanded. The viewers at home watched too, many of them leaning closer to their screens, recognizing this wasn't drama, it was documentation. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just control the room, she owned the story. She had brought a flag to confront history. Now she was bringing receipts to confront power. And with every page in that folder, the illusion of Joe Biden's righteousness was beginning to tear. Not with noise, but with paper. The air was already tight, thick with the weight of papers, silence, and a flag that refused to be ignored. But then the chairman adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, announcing the next witness. The name wasn't familiar to the general public, but it struck a chord with a few on the panel. Marcus Whitaker, former senior aide to the Department of Veterans Affairs, with direct ties to the fiscal operations under President Biden's administration. The doors opened and Marcus entered, walking stiffly, like his suit weighed more than it should. He was tall but carried himself as if he wanted to fold into the shadows. A staffer leaned toward another and whispered, "He looks like he's about to confess to murder," triggering a few stifled chuckles in the gallery. Nervous laughter fluttered briefly across the room like a moth searching for light. Not because anything was funny, but because everyone could sense what was coming, and no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Marcus reached the table and sat down slowly, never quite looking up, his hands trembling just enough to betray the weight of what he carried. The microphone adjusted itself with a quiet mechanical buzz, and when he finally looked up, his face was already flushed with tension. The chairman asked if he was ready to testify. Marcus nodded once, barely audible, and then exhaled like a man who'd held his breath for years. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "My name is Marcus Whitaker. I served as Director of Internal Communications at the Department of Veterans Affairs from 2021 through early 2024. His eyes flicked toward Jasmine, then to the stack of papers she had submitted minutes earlier. "Everything in that folder is accurate," he said. "No qualifiers, no legal hedging, just a plain, brutal confirmation. I was present during the October 17th meeting when the decision was made to reallocate $78 million from minority veteran outreach programs towards strategic image campaigns designed for swing state visibility." A gasp didn't follow, only stillness. Stillness laced with disbelief. He continued, "I drafted the internal memo. The low ROI note That was paraphrased from a comment made by Deputy Chief Randall Brooks. The language wasn't corrected because the priority was speed, not accountability. The weight of the words settled slowly but irrevocably. Jasmine sat still, her face unreadable, though her grip on the velvet case beside her tightened slightly. Biden shifted in his chair but didn't speak. The energy in the room shifted from tension to reckoning. Every pair of eyes, those of journalists, veterans, Congress members, and citizens watching from home, zeroed in on Marcus Whitaker, not as a man destroying his own career, but as one salvaging a sliver of his conscience. The joke was over. The whisper about confessing to murder now seemed grimly prophetic. Marcus had detonated a truth that not even the most polished press release could walk back. Jasmine's folder wasn't a stunt. It was a ledger of betrayal. And now the man who helped write it had just read it aloud, for the nation to hear. The hearing room didn't explode. It imploded, quietly, irreversibly. Jasmine sat perfectly still. The weight of Marcus Whitaker's confession still lingered in the air, like dust unsettled by a collapsed ceiling. No one spoke. No one dared. Then, without a word, she reached once more into the worn leather folder that had never left her side. This time, what she pulled out wasn't a memo or a policy document. It was older, fragile, personal. A black and white photograph, faded at the edges, creased across the middle like it had lived in a wallet for decades. She placed it gently on the table, turning it so the cameras and Biden could see. It was her grandfather, Clarence Crockett, in full uniform, standing beside a Jeep, boots caked in mud, his expression somewhere between pride and exhaustion. There was something unmistakably American about the image, even as the man in it had been denied every promise that uniform was supposed to deliver. Jasmine didn't explain the photo. She didn't need to. The picture told its own story, of sacrifice, of invisibility, of dignity never fully acknowledged. Behind her, a quiet sound began to rise. Not voices, not shouts, but sniffles. Veterans seated in the gallery, some in faded hats with patches from Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm, began to wipe their eyes. One man clutched his cane tighter. Another closed his eyes, lips trembling, as if the image on that table had summoned someone they once knew. Jasmine looked straight ahead, not to the press, not to the chairman, but to the memory of her grandfather now laid bare for the nation to witness. That photo was more than just paper. It was testimony. And suddenly the chamber that had once echoed with dismissive laughter now pulsed with something heavier: recognition. As the camera panned across the gallery to capture the reaction, it stopped on a woman seated in the third row. Her dress was gray-blue, simple, her hair pulled back with care. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale from pressure. It was Jill Biden. She hadn't moved much during the hearing, had sat quietly while her husband held the mic, told jokes, made accusations. But now, as her gaze settled on the photograph on the table, her entire posture shifted. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She simply lowered her gaze, as if the image of Clarence Crockett had pierced through years of carefully constructed defenses. Her fingers tightened around each other, not in shame, but in realization. Realization that her husband's words, flung carelessly like stones, had landed on the grave of a man whose sacrifice neither history nor policy had fully honored. In that moment, there were no more lines between left and right, red or blue. There was only a folded flag, a photograph of a forgotten hero, and a silence that spoke louder than any defense could muster. No statement, no rebuttal, just the quiet devastation of truth, sitting in the open for the first time in 78 years. And the woman in the third row could only look down, because for once, even she couldn't look away. The room had not recovered. The photograph of Clarence Crockett still sat on the table like a witness sworn in by history, and the veterans behind Jasmine had stopped blinking, their hands still, their breathing shallow. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into her folder one final time and pulled out a slim manila envelope, sealed not with ceremony, but with bureaucratic indifference. She laid it down beside the photo and unfolded a sheet from within. This, she said quietly, is the file of Specialist Darnell Hayes. Bronze Star, 2 tours, honorably discharged, diagnosed with PTSD. He applied for treatment in January of last year. She didn't pause for drama. She paused because that's how grief moves. Slowly, carefully, like it might break if handled too fast. He waited 9 months. His claim was delayed, deferred, eventually denied. He applied again. Denied again. Her voice didn't rise, but the pain behind it began to fill the room. 2 weeks after his second denial, she continued, her eyes locked on no one and everyone at once. He took his own life. She didn't flinch. In his garage, while his wife and his 10-year-old son were asleep upstairs, a sound came from the gallery, not a gasp, but a woman's hand covering her mouth. Somewhere in the chamber, a staffer quietly set down a pen they hadn't used for several minutes. The paper Jasmine held trembled slightly in her fingers, but not from weakness, from memory. And everyone listening knew this wasn't a case study. It was a funeral being told in the present tense. With a motion as deliberate as it was devastating, Jasmine reached beside her and lifted the same folded flag, the one given to her family for Clarence. She held it up, not above her head, not for display, but just enough so that Biden and everyone in the room could see it clearly. He died serving this country, she said. This, she looked down at the cloth, heavy in her hands. This is the only thing they gave us in return. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. The words came as a simple statement of fact, and that made them hurt even more. She laid the flag back on the table gently, like laying a child to rest, then looked up, not for attention, but for accountability. No one dared speak, not the chairman, not the press, not even Biden. The silence wasn't respectful. It was unbearable. The kind that presses down on the chest and makes breathing feel like betrayal. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't even about policy. It was about a pattern of abandonment, of silence, of deaths that came not from war zones, but from waiting lines and broken promises. And in that moment, the nation saw it, not through headlines or hashtags, but through a flag, a file, and a name no one had bothered to remember, until Jasmine Crockett made sure they could never forget. The silence after Jasmine laid down the folded flag lingered like smoke after a battlefield burn. Thick, acrid, unforgettable. But not everyone could sit with it. Joe Biden, who had once ruled a room with charm and presence, now sat red-faced, his fingers twitching on the microphone base. The silence didn't just discomfort him, it undid him. He leaned forward, eyes sharp, jaw clenched, and let the words fly. "You're just playing identity politics," he snapped louder than necessary, his voice ricocheting off the chamber walls. The words didn't sting. They echoed with the desperation of a man trying to salvage a narrative that had already collapsed under truth. A few aides behind him shuffled nervously, and a stunned murmur fluttered through the gallery. Even the stenographer seemed momentarily frozen, unsure whether to capture anger or shame. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him at first. She adjusted the edge of the folder, carefully lining it with the edge of the table, before finally meeting his eyes with a look not of anger, but clarity. "No," she said, calm as stone. "I'm catching up with 78 years of erasure." The contrast between their tones couldn't have been sharper. He was shouting. She was revealing. He threw accusations. She carried proof. In that moment, viewers across the country didn't see a political debate. They saw a man unraveling and a woman standing in the full weight of truth without raising her voice. Biden had tried to use noise as a shield, but the louder he got, the more clearly he exposed his fear. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice to regain control of the room. She already had it. Slowly, she turned to face the chairman, her expression unreadable, but her presence undeniable. "Mr. Chairman," she said clearly, "I move to censure Mr. Biden for conduct unbecoming a congressional witness and for violating the decorum of this body." The words landed like a quiet grenade, not explosive, but irreversible. The chairman blinked, caught slightly off guard, but quickly composed himself. "The motion is recognized," he replied. The gavel slammed once. Not with anger, but with authority. A vote was called. No shouting followed. No dramatic rebuttal. Just the cold, procedural steps of consequence unfolding in real time. Biden, still seated, looked around as if trying to gauge how much of the room he still owned. But something had shifted. The cameras no longer followed his expressions. They lingered on Jasmine's face, on the folded flag, on the photograph of a soldier who had given his life for a country that almost forgot him. Biden had come to the hearing expecting applause and deference. What he received instead was exposure and reckoning. And in the silence between the gavel's strike and the roll call, America saw the difference between power that demands attention and truth that doesn't need to ask. The hearing room sat like a cathedral in mourning, quiet, still, reverent. The flag lay before Jasmine Crockett like a page that had finally been turned after 78 years of silence. The air was no longer just tense, it was sacred. No one dared shift in their seats, and even the usually restless press corps held their breath as the chairman cleared his throat to announce a written statement submitted by a private citizen. But this wasn't just any citizen. It was the son of a man Clarence Crockett had once saved. The chairman gave a nod, and an aide stepped forward holding the letter with both hands like it was a relic. He adjusted the microphone, and in a clear but solemn voice, he began to read. To Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and to this committee, the letter started. My name is Gerald L. Rusk. I am 74 years old. I am the son of Corporal William Rusk, a white infantryman with the 29th Infantry Division who fought at Utah Beach on D-Day. The letter shook slightly in the aide's hands as he continued. While going through my late mother's attic, I found a letter my father wrote in 1946, but never sent. In it, he described the moments after mortar fire struck his unit. He had taken shrapnel to the shoulder and was bleeding out in an open field. He wrote, I would not have lived another 5 minutes if not for a black soldier named Clarence Crockett, who dragged me 300 yards under fire. I never saw him again. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery, but no one dared speak. The aide paused, visibly shaken by the words he was reading, before continuing. My father said he had planned to thank Clarence's family, but never had the courage. He always believed that someone else had already honored him. He was wrong, so I say it now. To his granddaughter, to his family, and to every person who ever wore the uniform. We never said thank you, but I will now. In the gallery, one older veteran, stoic until this point, put his hand over his eyes and wept silently. A woman beside him reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Another nodded slowly, lips trembling, as if she'd been waiting years to hear someone else say what she could never put into words. Jasmine sat unmoving, absorbing the words like they had been written for her alone. But in truth, they had been written for all of them. Every unseen, unthanked, unrecorded soldier whose story had lived only in footnotes and family whispers. And now, finally, that story had a voice. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She took a breath, a long, steady inhale that carried with it 1,000 unsaid things. Then, with the same deliberate grace that had defined every one of her actions that day, she leaned forward and reached for the folded flag on the table. The camera zoomed in as her fingers touched the fabric, careful and certain, like she was handling a living memory. She didn't hold it high like a trophy. She simply lifted it just above the table. Enough for the room to see, enough for the silence to settle again. This, she began, her voice steady and unshaken, isn't a symbol. She looked down at it, then back at the room, letting her gaze sweep slowly across every face. Democrat, Republican, veteran, civilian, press. This flag, she continued, is evidence. Evidence of the cost paid by people who never got the receipt. Evidence of a man who saved lives on foreign soil and was forgotten on his own. Evidence of courage that wasn't tallied in official records because it came wrapped in black skin. Her tone was calm but electric, the kind of calm that fills a courtroom right before the verdict. This flag didn't come from ceremony, she said. It came from absence, from a funeral that never happened, from a government that never wrote the name down. She paused, not for effect, but because the truth required space to land. Then she said, "And I dare anyone in this chamber, anyone in this country, to carry its weight." No one responded, not with rebuttal, not with applause, because in that moment it became brutally clear this flag, folded and faded, carried more truth than 1,000 campaign speeches. It didn't need policy to justify its presence. It didn't need permission to exist. It was justice, folded in cloth and carried in silence until now. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The nation was already listening. And with that flag in her hands, she didn't just speak for Clarence Crockett. She spoke for every ghost the country had forgotten to name. And Joe Biden, the man who once tried to define her patriotism with 11 careless words, sat frozen. Because the final blow hadn't come from confrontation. It had come from legacy, and legacy never asks for permission. It arrives quietly and rewrites the room. The hearing chamber was nearly empty now. The media had cleared out. The lights had dimmed to their after-session hum. But one seat remained noticeably untouched. The one Joe Biden had occupied just hours earlier. The nameplate still sat before it. His microphone lay idle, its cord coiled neatly like a snake that had lost its venom. No one had removed the chair, but its absence was louder than any exit statement he might have made. The space no longer belonged to power or politics. It belonged to silence, a silence earned, not enforced. Across from that vacant seat, Jasmine Crockett still sat, though the hearing had long been adjourned. Her back remained straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And beside her on the polished wood sat the same folded flag, untouched since she had laid it down hours before, but now transformed into something larger than its cloth. She didn't sit out of pride. There was no victory pose, no self-congratulatory smile. She remained seated out of purpose, because this wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the beginning of a correction. The photograph of her grandfather, Clarence Crockett, still lay beside the flag, quiet, still, resolute. That image, once hidden in drawers and attics, now held court at the center of America's most powerful chamber. It was no longer a private heirloom. It was part of the public record. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine withdrew from media appearances. She declined interviews, turned down cable invitations, and avoided podiums. Instead, she spent her evenings in a quiet office in D.C., a single desk lamp casting golden light across the files and notes now spread before her. On the wall hung the photo of her grandfather, framed, centered, and lit. On her desk beside her pen rested the folded flag, not as decoration, as reminder. She wasn't writing a speech this time. She was writing a bill, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in memory. In the margins of the draft, she wrote names, real names, names of soldiers whose benefits were delayed, veterans whose graves had no stone, families who had received flags but never explanations. Every line of the bill aimed to fix what had been ignored. Proper recognition for minority veterans, immediate PTSD treatment access, mandatory federal acknowledgement of unmarked war graves. It was titled the Clarence Crockett Act. She wrote not with fury, but with focus, not to retaliate against the past, but to protect the future. Because folded flags should not be substitutes for justice, and names once spoken should never disappear again. As the draft neared completion, she paused and looked out the window of her office, not to reflect, but to affirm. America hadn't buried her grandfather. They had misplaced him, and now she had brought him back. The story wasn't about vengeance, it was about restoration. And in restoring one man's place in history, Jasmine had reminded a nation of something it desperately needed to hear. We don't disappear. We don't fade. We don't yield. We remember. We testify. And we endure. Because justice, like a flag folded by love, not politics, always finds its way home. The characters Jasmine Crockett and Joe Biden featured in this story are entirely fictionalized and do not represent real individuals. This dramatized narrative is created for storytelling purposes only and is not intended to depict actual events or persons. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to my channel. Your support helps me continue writing powerful stories that speak truth, honor memory, and give voice to those history tried to forget. Hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Subscribe now, and because every flag has a story, and every story deserves to be told.